The Mr. Olympia stage has showcased the most incredible physiques in bodybuilding history. These legends represent the pinnacle of the sport, but even the best aren't without their flaws. Every legend has had that one thing that stood out, and not in a good way. In this video, we're diving into the worst flaws of every Mr. Olympia legend, so without further ado, let's proceed. And we're starting with the most recent Mr. Olympia, our 2024 and current champion, Samson Dauda. He's known for being a complete bodybuilder, a mass monster that's aesthetic at the same time. With his 2024 Olympia physique, there aren't too many things you can consider a weakness about his physique. However, his overall conditioning remains his biggest criticism. In my opinion, Samson Dauda's biggest flaw is his conditioning. Next, we have the 2023 Mr. Olympia, Derek Lunsford. Derek is not a balanced bodybuilder like Samson. He has some freaky good qualities like his back or his crazy taper, but also more weaknesses. Some of his weaknesses could be considered his legs from the front, particularly the quad sweeps. Some people consider his abs his biggest flaw. In the past, he's been criticized for his arms and chest. In my opinion, Derek Lunsford's biggest flaw is his overall muscle definition, especially from the front. Next is the 2022 Mr. Olympia, Hadi Choopan. His case is more similar to Derek's than Samson's. He too has some crazy traits like his abs, quads, or overall dryness, but also some pretty glaring weaknesses. Just like in Derek's case, his overall size in terms of height could be considered a weakness, but in my opinion, Hadi Choopan's biggest weakness is his arms and shoulders. Next up, we have the 2020 and 2021 two-time Mr. Olympia, Big Ramy. During his career, conditioning had always been his biggest criticism, otherwise being arguably the freakiest mass monster of all time. After he became Mr. Olympia, he started to showcase several weaknesses in certain muscle groups, especially his lower lats. So if we're talking about prime Big Ramy, which in my opinion is him pre-winning the Olympia, conditioning is his biggest flaw, and if we're talking during his Olympia reign, his biggest weakness was his back. Next, we have the 2019 Mr. Olympia, Brandon Curry. Brandon had one of the most complete upper bodies in bodybuilding history, both in structure and muscle completeness, missing basically nothing. His biggest weakness has always been his lower body, but also his overall conditioning. In my opinion, if I were to pinpoint his biggest flaw, I would consider his lower body from the rear, including glutes, hamstrings, and calves. Next, we have the 2018 Mr. Olympia, Shawn Rhoden. During his career, Shawn was not a consistent bodybuilder, so you could consider his conditioning as a flaw. However, in 2018, when he won the Mr. Olympia and the physique that's most relevant for his legacy, conditioning was arguably his strongest point. In my opinion, Shawn Rhoden's biggest flaw as Mr. Olympia was his overall upper body mass, including his back, biceps, and triceps. Next, we have the 7-time Mr. Olympia, Phil Heath, with his 2011-2017 reign. Phil is probably the most complete bodybuilder of all time in terms of muscle groups. During his prime, which I would consider 2011-2013, his only flaw was about his bone structure, namely his clavicle bone width. After that, we all know his biggest issue was regarding his midsection. Because of a hernia problem, Phil won several Olympias with a very unappealing looking midsection, so I would consider the midsection Phil Heath's biggest flaw. Next up is Greene, not an Olympia winner, but the title of this video is about Olympia legends, not winners only. Greene is the biggest name in bodybuilding after Phil Heath in the past 15 years, so he definitely deserves a mention. Himself had a midsection issue, aka a bubble gut. Another weakness for him was his traps, but in my opinion, his biggest flaw was his shoulders, outer arms, and forearms, most visible in poses like the side chest and especially the most muscular. Next, we have the four-time Mr. Olympia Jay Cutler with his 2006, 2007, 2009, and 2010 wins. One of Jay's criticisms had always been his blocker structure, with his wide waist, long torso, and short limbs. He also had a period when his conditioning was questionable. However, in my opinion, Jay Cutler's biggest flaw remains his back. Now, his back was pretty good, but his lower lats were lacking and unbalanced, which made him lose the back poses against his biggest rivals like Ronnie Coleman, Heath, and Dexter Jackson. Next is Dexter Jackson, the 2008 Mr. Olympia. He's one of those complete, consistent bodybuilders who, when standing by themselves, have very few weaknesses. Usually, some of the criticisms were his narrow structure, just like in Phil Heath's case, or his calves, probably his only weak muscle group. In my opinion, Dexter Jackson's biggest flaw, or rather disadvantage in this case, is his overall size. He was a shorter, more compact bodybuilder who usually got dwarfed by his strongest opposition. And speaking of strongest opposition, next up is the 8-time Mr. Olympia Ronnie Coleman, the champion between 1998 and 2005. Arguably the greatest bodybuilder of all time, it's not an easy task to find a real weakness. However, we all know he actually always had a glaring weakness that we were eager to ignore because he was that great everywhere else. Yep, it's a no-brainer. Ronnie's midsection and ab development were definitely always his biggest weaknesses, whether we're talking about his 90s physiques or his bigger ones after 2003. If you enjoy unique videos like this, make sure to subscribe. I'm aiming for 30k subscribers by the end of the year. We're currently at 27.6k. Next up, we have another uncrowned Mr. Olympia in Flex Wheeler. Considered by many the most gifted bodybuilder of all time, his only natural weakness was probably his clavicle bone width, just like in Phil Heath's and Dexter Jackson's cases. However, due to his inconsistency, some of his biggest weaknesses became his conditioning, especially from the back. Flex Wheeler's biggest flaw was his glute hamstring development and definition. Next, we have the 6-time Mr. Olympia Dorian Yates with his wins between 1992 and 1997. Dorian Yates is a special case of a physique that was undeniable because of certain traits like his back, overall conditioning and hardness, but also had several big weaker points for a Mr. Olympia, like his biceps, chest and quad sweeps. In my opinion, Dorian Yates' biggest flaw could be considered the completeness aspect. Next, we have another uncrowned Mr. Olympia, the 4-time runner-up Kevin Levrone. Just like in Flex Wheeler's case, his consistency with conditioning was also a big criticism for him throughout his career. Kevin Levrone had a very well-rounded physique, but some of his weaker body parts, especially against his opposition, were his back, his abby definition, and later in his career, his quads. If I were to pinpoint his biggest flaw, I would say consistency. Next, we have the 8-time Mr. Olympia between 1984 and 1991, Lee Haney. His physique and his opposition, especially in the 80s, were more similar to today's classic physique division. So against modern open guys, we can find several weaknesses. However, I'll adjust the criteria to the era every competitor comes from. Lee Haney was a complete bodybuilder, but his lower body, especially his hamstrings and calves, were underwhelming. However, in my opinion, Lee Haney's biggest flaw was his abs development. Next, we have another uncrowned Mr. Olympia, Shawn Ray, arguably the bodybuilder with the least amount of flaws on this list. When standing by himself, there are truly little things you can take away from him. However, when standing against his opposition, there's one big flaw Shawn Ray had that is more than obvious, namely his overall size. He was a smaller bodybuilder, considerably smaller than his biggest opposition, similar to Dexter Jackson's case. Next, we have the 1983 Mr. Olympia, Samir Bannout. His physique in 1983 was far ahead of its time with an unprecedented back and great conditioning. However, in terms of consistency, Samir is the weakest Mr. Olympia of all time. The following year, he placed 6th at the Olympia, and then he entered 6 more Olympias during the 80s and 90s and never finished higher than 8, so consistency was definitely his biggest flaw. But if we're talking about his 1983 Mr. Olympia winning version, his overall size was his only flaw, him being a smaller bodybuilder. Next, we have the 1982 Mr. Olympia, Chris Dickerson, often regarded as the least impressive Mr. Olympia of all time. Indeed, there was nothing out of the ordinary with Chris's physique. However, he had a balanced physique. His biggest flaw has to be his unusual pointy elbows, which were really distracting and unusual for a human body. Next, we have the 3-time Mr. Olympia, Frank Zane, with his wins between 1977 and 1979. The godfather of aesthetics, Frank Zane had several weaknesses during that era, all of them being in terms of overall size and muscularity. He was the most aesthetic Mr. Olympia of all time, but also the least muscular Mr. Olympia ever. Next is Franco Columbo, the 1976 and 1981 2-time Mr. Olympia. During his prime, Franco was a complete bodybuilder, but his weaker point has always been his overall height and size. He's the shortest Mr. Olympia winner in history, standing at 5 feet 5 inches or 1.65 meters. Other weaknesses could be considered his arms, especially since in that era his opposition had great arms in general, but his biggest flaw remains his overall height, in my opinion. Next is the one and only Arnold Schwarzenegger, the 7-time Mr. Olympia between 1970 and 1975, plus his comeback win in 1980. For his time, Arnold was a game changer in terms of conditioning, posing, and muscularity. However, he wasn't without flaws. He had some of the greatest biceps ever, but his triceps were never at the same level, for example. Also, sometimes he had criticisms about his legs, but in my opinion, the Oak's biggest flaw was his midsection, both in terms of structure, having wider hips, but also with a poorly defined 4-pack as abs. Next is Sergio Oliva, the 3-time Mr. Olympia between 1967 and 1969, arguably the bodybuilder with genetically the least amount of weaknesses of any Mr. Olympia legend ever. He had great arms, the smallest waist for a Mr. Olympia, a complete back, and good legs for the time. His genetics were indeed next level. However, he relied too much on genetics versus hard work. There are stories about him that he almost wasn't doing anything special in terms of dieting when prepping for a show, and indeed, his conditioning could have been better, so conditioning it is for Sergio Oliva's biggest flaw. Last but not least is the first ever Mr. Olympia, Larry Scott. Bodybuilding was really different in the mid-60s even compared to the 70s. Larry Scott was a well-rounded bodybuilder for the time, but his biggest flaw was definitely his structure regarding his waist. He had a wide waist, and combined with his short limbs, it gave him odd proportions, especially for an era where aesthetics were very important. That wraps up our look at the worst flaws of some of the biggest Mr. Olympia legends. Whether you agree or not, it's always interesting to examine even the greatest bodybuilders with a critical eye. Let me know in the comments what you think about my analysis. Don't forget to like for the algorithm, subscribe to stay updated, and see you next time.